President Cyril Ramaphosa says South Africa's G20 presidency serves as a great opportunity for African voices to be heard. Speaking during the opening of the G20 Foreign Ministers Meeting in Johannesburg, the president says the G20 is also looking at ways to end hunger and poverty, especially in developing countries. The two-day foreign affairs meeting will discuss themes of the G20, which are solidarity, equality and sustainability. South Africa assumed the presidency of the G20 on the 1st of December last year. To talk further on the G20 Foreign Ministers Meeting, we are now joined by a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre of African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg, Dr. Oscar van Heerden. Great to have you. Thanks for joining us, Dr. van Heerden.
Good morning, Leanne, and good morning to the viewers.
So it's kicked off. It's happening. It's now happening. We had the foreign ministers from G20 top economies meeting in South Africa amid a lot of geopolitical rifts and, of course, with the top US diplomat staying away owing to a feud with its host, South Africa. There's so much happening, but what is your take at the moment? Is it rendering the G20 more fractious at this point?
No, not at all. I think it's obviously quite concerning that not only the largest and most powerful country in the world decided to boycott, so to speak, the G20. We must remember, Leanne, they did send some diplomat to represent Marco Rubio. So they are not completely disinterested. At least they are sending someone. But it is concerning that the Secretary of State decided not to come, and we are now told so too the Finance Minister is not going to make it next week. These are concerns, and I think the South African government is aware of them. Minister Lamola has indicated that they are trying their level best to make contact and get access to the Trump administration in order to explain themselves, but this is not happening. So we find that there's general intransigence on the side of the United States, and it is quite concerning. But I do think, as the name itself says, the G20, there are 19 other major economies that are here, that are present, and that have expressed their support for the South African presidency.
Yeah, which is important because, you know, this is, I don't think that South Africa is alone in finding this Trump administration literally firing shots from all directions. So I don't think South Africa is alone. However, you know, holding the presidency of the G20 is a great honor and one that South Africa desperately needs, not only for South Africa, but for the continent in general. But do you think, just to sort of wrap up this issue, do you think the interference from Trump and, you know, what he's saying about South Africa's domestic affairs, should it be viewed as an attack on G20 norms?
Well, as we know, Leanne, what we know of the Trump presidency, his first term, for example, in 2016 to 2020, he was generally very anti-multilateral, the multilateral system. And so it's nothing new that he is expressing concern against not only BRICS, he's expressing concern against NATO, now he's expressing concerns against the G20. So he's very consistent. But I do think that the State Department is going to have to do some introspection, because at the end of the day, no matter how powerful you might be, you cannot operate in isolation. And I think what we're seeing now is many countries that have been targeted by Trump, the European Union, their allies, the Canada and Mexico. He's taken pot shots at Ukraine and China. So generally, I think the mood at this G20 is one that says we're not in full agreement with the Trump administration, with President Trump. He's basing his decisions on emotions and misinformation. We know South Africa, we've worked with South Africa, and we are prepared to continue working with South Africa. And I think that is really the sort of order that we are seeing at the G20.
Yeah, and also just looking at this issue even deeper, I mean, the issue with Russia and the US, because this is now something as well where we heard comments coming from Trump talking about the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, almost calling him a dictator and, saying that he started the war. In the background to all of this, we read that South Africa has actually invited Vladimir Zelensky for a state visit to South Africa. I know we've got very close relations with Russia, but now holding out a hand to the Ukraine as well. I mean, what are you reading into, what's going on with these kind of moves from South Africa towards perhaps where the US stands on certain global issues?
Leanne, what I see, which is actually quite a clever move diplomatically, what the South African government is doing is trying to send out a message globally that it is consistent in its application of international law, of the multilateral system and the international order. I think we now know that the Trump administration is engaging with Russia, one of our close allies. There's no animosity lost there. And so this is the moment to say to the world that we are not biased, that we are not only taking one side in this conflict, that actually we are saying that the territorial integrity of Ukraine is important for any country, and that international law should have been maintained. And sending out that message at this moment is actually quite a clever diplomatic move.
Yeah. So South Africa, what I think from what we heard the president saying during his opening address yesterday is that the country is seeking buy-in to its developmental agenda and the importance of reforming multilateral institutions. With the US's absence in this, can it get G20 nations to reach a consensus on something like this? I know we said that there was representation from the US there. I think he was, the individual that was there was the second in charge of the US embassy represented in South Africa. So I'm not too sure where the decision-making process would lie with somebody like that as a representative when you're surrounded by, the heads of foreign missions in different countries. That's a reality. So what do you think about that?
Look, two things, Leanne. Firstly, I think the important thing with the junior diplomat is that Marco Rubio obviously is going to contact him and say, what did they say? And so the message is definitely getting to the State Department. I think that is the important thing. How they deal with it, how they respond to it, that's another matter. The second thing is that I think that we are moving towards a multipolar world. The superpower, the unipolar power, which was the USA for the longest time, since 1990, has come to an end. And so we must see through that lens, this G20, decisions taken here is commitments made by 19 of the largest economies in the world for a fairer, more developmental world. And they are going to stick to those decisions, whether the US is on board or not. Yeah. Now, of course, the United States can put be a spanner in the works. But I think that as long as there's unity at the end of this process, and they speak with one language, with one objective, I think it's going to be very difficult for the Trump administration to want to go against the grain in many respects.
Yeah. Do you think this is the start of the US actually withdrawing from the G20 altogether? And if that is the feeling that the meeting is getting and the messages that we are getting, should it be up to the meeting of the G20 to decide, is the US the place that should be taking over as host next year? Is it appropriate under these conditions? I wonder if something like that would be discussed.
I don't think it will be discussed publicly, but that will certainly be the talk in the back rooms, behind closed doors. If you decide to boycott the gathering, what then makes you deserve to take over the presidency next year? Why should the countries, the 19 economies, the AU, the EU, and invited guests come to your G20 when you decided to be inhospitable towards the current host? So it's certainly something that will be discussed, as I say, behind closed doors, and a message will certainly be formulated as we move towards the actual summit in November. I do believe, Leanne, and I'm putting my neck out there as I usually do, I do believe that Trump is going to come to the G20 in November.
Yeah.
And it's the right thing to do. He's going to come, albeit very blusterous and with an attitude, as always. But he's going to come and he's going to take over the handover and make a very clear statement about what it is that the United States want to do going forward with the right-wing agenda that is pushing globally.
Yeah, sure. I'll hold you to that. We'll replay this clip when the time does come, because as you say, I mean, so far the foreign minister, the finance minister, all saying they're not going to be attending these gatherings, and these are very important portfolios. This is a big opportunity for China, though. I mean, what do you think of that? Because obviously, with the absence of the US, the world's second biggest economy is very much so represented. Do you think that it'll extend its influence as it comes there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they've seen the gap. They took it immediately as soon as the Secretary of State said he's not coming to the ministers' gathering. The ambassador of China, I'm sure after one phone call to Beijing, made it abundantly clear of the full support that China is giving to the South Africans in terms of their presidency, and indicated that they are prepared to assist in whichever way. Now, those are very strong words. They're basically saying that if the number one economy doesn't want to step up to its responsibilities, then we as the number two will gladly fill that position. And I do dare say it's precisely that kind of political maneuvering, diplomatic maneuvering, that the State Department is going to take notice of. It's one thing to boycott, but it's quite another to give the sphere of influence to the Chinese, which, as we know, the Americans have a very serious problem with at this point in time.
Yeah. Oh, this is going to be so many stories and sideline stories developing here, Dr. van Heerden, and it's extremely interesting. I'm even reading something from Associated Press where they were speaking to delegates on the sideline, because usually there's that big family photograph that they take on the stage of all of the different ministers and delegates that are there. And this year it didn't happen because, according to what AP are reporting, nobody wanted to stand next to the Russian foreign minister. And that was the reason why they didn't want that photograph to be taken. So there are so many stories to be told out of this. Dr. Oscar van Heerden, thank you. I hope we talk to you again when we see the finance ministers gathering for the next meeting. Of course, Dr. van Heerden is a senior research fellow for the Center of African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg.